Hello, welcome back to the Scale Modelling Cafe and part 2 of the Hobby Boss 1/48 scale Antonov Colt. In this episode we're going to get the model ready so we can actually start building it. Moulded onto the wing surface were some rather horrible representations of the fabric, so frankly that had to go, and it was all sanded flush. And this meant I could start off doing the scribing job. So using some Dymo tape, and this is a pea cutter here from Tamiya, I just went ahead and made up, obviously, completely rescribing the wings and the tail, getting rid of that horrible texture. The idea behind this was that the people, they found this abandoned aeroplane. A lot of the fabric had rotted away, and what they did is they stripped it and then they skinned it with very thin sheet steel. Being engineers, they cut the various bits and pieces to size, and in a traditional way, effectively, added them to cover the surfaces. So that meant everything had to be scribed in. The advantage of doing a fantasy model such as this is you can just, there's no plans or anything like that, but it is important to try and get it, I thought anyway at least, to try and get it symmetrical between the left and right. So there was some measuring that went on, a little bit of eyeballing if I'm honest, but just using the Dymo tape as a guide, we can just draw the scriber along and make those panel lines. Once I'd done the scribing job, it was on to the riveting, and this is what I tend to do in all my models that I'm going to rivet. Is I do quite a liberal black oil wash, so all the detail is highlighted, and then it's much easier to see the actual panel line. So when you're running the riveter along, you know exactly where to stop, and it's easier just to sort of imagine exactly where you're going with things. So here I'm just polishing it off with just kitchen towel. And you can see there how it does highlight those lines. This is just a bit of a polisher. It's an extremely well worn thing. I've had it for donkey's years, and that can just help as well. Right, on with the riveter then. I'm using the Galaxy Tools riveter. I think this is the 0.4mm wheel. And just using a metal edge, I'm just going to run it all the way along both sides of every panel line. This will just outline everything and help to make the surface look really quite busy. I'm just running my finger along there. What it does is the harder you press, the deeper obviously the rivet's going to be, but it does create a little crater. Some people sand that off and sand it all flush. I don't. I find it's a bit of a nightmare trying to get rid of all the dust actually from the rivets, because they are very small. But actually I quite like that little raised edge, because when we come to do later weathering, you can polish the paint surface and it will reveal the outline of the rivet. Not always about using the straight edge. If you're feeling brave, you can go in freehand. It does take a lot of concentration. I have to get in close. You might see the I've got my optivisor on coming into shot, so apologies about that, but you do need a really good view. Doing the wings, it's relatively straightforward because they are flat, so you can apply a fair amount of pressure, and just taking my time and going slowly to avoid errors. It's very easy to start rushing and you get a wonky line, you have to then fill, sand and start again, and it will slow you right down. So take your time and you should be fine. Right, so with all the panel lines outlined, I'm going to use this pen to just mark in the rows of rivets. Some people just eyeball it and go straight for it. I don't like doing that, if I'm honest. I do like a little mark. But it's quite handy here, where I've removed the raised, sort of the horrible fabric rib texture, it actually left a dark shadow on the plastic, which was awesome because I didn't have to measure anything in all these areas. And it was straightforward just to make a little line. It is very faint, but if you just make a little line with the pen, you know exactly where to do the rows of rivets. And also, it helps to keep things nice and parallel, especially when you've got the guide there that I'm tapping out of that's the top of the fuel tank, and it had these raised lines along it, so it was really easy to keep things parallel and, I suppose, vertical, if that's the right word. So in with the riveter along the straight edge, and we can just draw in these lines, not forgetting the leading edge, of course. Now obviously you don't necessarily need to mark the leading edge, because we've got the guide at the back with the pen, and we know it's parallel with the, as I said, those raised ribs along the top of the fuel tank. So we're just going to work our way along. Now, I do find, if I'm honest, this whole process really quite tedious, but it makes such a difference. It's worth just pushing on through. I've got various strategies not to go too doolally. Sometimes I'll do this in the living room on a tray with the television on. Sometimes listen to podcasts. Anything really to keep me sane. But you do need to keep up your concentration, because it's easy to do a wonky line or forget where you're going, because I do want this to be symmetrical with the other side. Some of these smaller, thinner panels, it's easy enough just to mark halfway between the panel lines. And I'm just going to do one row on the horizontal surfaces, I suppose you could call them. And just eyeballing that, just making it parallel with the other panel lines that I've already scribed in. And this is fairly quick. Sometimes, as I've just done here, it is worth just marking the other side, just to help make sure it's parallel. And there we go. That's quite quick. Right, with this larger panel here, there's a couple of things you can do. You can measure it, but as you can see, there's a panel line here which is in the middle. So I'll use that panel line as a marker, and then using the same technique as just before, just halfway on the other side, I'll just eyeball a little mark as well. And I'm just eyeballing it again using the panel line. The closer it is to the panel line, obviously the easier it is to get it parallel. And this is obviously quite close, so it's not too bad. And then as I move back down again, just twisting it around because it's easier, and I'll do the other side and then the middle last, it's easier then to, like I say, to keep it parallel. So there's various different tips and techniques you can use to get these parallel lines. And if you're feeling really, really brave, you can go in and do it freehand. I'm a bit of a coward when it comes to this sort of thing, and I'm not going to do that. And I think there's, with all the, the best will in the world, you're never going to get it perfectly straight if you are going to freehand it. So just using this little flexible metal ruler is, for me, well worth it. And you can see it's starting to take shape now. Let's just zoom in. And you can see how busy that surface looks compared to if it wasn't riveted. Right, so with all the riveting done, it's time to modify the fuselage halves. You can see there at the front I've cut out a big rectangle. That's where the 4 portholes were. The interior is going to be highly detailed, and I want to show that off. I'm going to cut here a door on the other side. So this is a door that I've modified with a bit of plastic card to make it bigger from the Humvee. And then all I did is I just tacked it in place using some black paint, sprayed around the edge, and I'll use that as my guide. Going in with the motor tool, I'm just going to chain drill now, just on the inside of the painted area. Now it's time to connect all the dots. So just using a scalpel blade, I'm just going to go in. I'm going to cut through. The plastic here is quite thick. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll thin the inside of the plastic, but I couldn't really do that here because oops, got the blade stuck. Obviously it's all going to be on show because the cargo door on the other side is going to be open as well. So I couldn't thin it down, which is a shame. But once the door has been removed, I can go in with scalpels, files, sanding sticks, anything really to try and open up the area. Now this big file is really useful for this because I need it perfectly straight. And I'll just go in and I'll just use that file and I'll just keep filing up to the edge, just doing a little bit of at a time. Unfortunately it's a bit too wide for the top and bottom bits, but when it's all clean and I've cut out some hinges, you see actually it sticks in place and it fits, really quite nicely. I was pleased with how that came out. And if we just do a bit of dry fit and hold it up, you can see there that's going to let in loads of light into the interior. Right, these are the waist gunner positions. So I sized it out and placed a piece of tape this time on where I wanted it, and I'm just going to go in with the scriber, and initially I'm just going to scribe where I want the gunner position to go. And then I'll go in and I'll do the old chain drillage and use the same process to cut the window out. But using this bit of tape and lining it up and with measuring with panel lines and things like that, I can make sure that the waist gunner side on the other side is in exactly the same position and exactly the same size. So I'm going to go fairly deep, but I don't want to go too deep, because what I don't want to do is, if you go too deep, you make the panel lines a bit too soft because of the thickness of the metal on the pea cutter itself. So there we go. I'm just going to put the masking tape in the same place. That other piece of tape there on the fuselage I've put there as a guide. So that was put on that panel line. And then I can measure out exactly where I'm going. So here I am just opening up those scriber lines with the scriber. And then, as I said, I don't want those lines to get too wide. So it's in with the scalpel. And we'll just open it up using the scalpel. I thought I had done chain drilling on this. I'm actually recording this quite a few weeks after I did this. So, struggling to remember if I'm honest. And there we go. There's the rough cut waist gunner's position. And again, using files, sanding sticks, scalpel, whatever's best for what I need to do at the time is I'll just neaten that up. And you can see what a mess it makes of the bench. Just bits everywhere. So I've had these files for donkey's years, and I don't use them too often, but things like this, they're really good for getting that straight edge. I find some of the sanding sticks, if I'm honest, they're a bit too thin, they're a bit too bendy, but using the file, it's easier to get perfectly straight edge. Okay, in the top of the fuselage, behind the cockpit, is going to be the mid-upper gunner. And I'm using an old turret from a 1/48 scale Tamiya Lancaster. I cut out a circle as a bit of a template and drew it out. Bit of chain drilling. And I'm just going to use these nippers here just to do the rough cut. Now this doesn't have to be perfectly circular, because the fairing I'm going to put over the top is going to cover most of this up, and it's going to be extremely difficult to see from the fuselage looking up. So it doesn't have to be too neat or too symmetrical, but I've got a little bit of OCD, so I do want it not too rough. So just going in now with the scalpel, I'm just going to circle that off, if that's a phrase. And just taping together the cockpit structure. It builds up a bit like a helicopter, really, where you build up the internal cabin. And you can see the roof is going to have to be cut as well. Right, finally we can start gluing some bits together. So the tailplanes come in 2 halves. And these are just going to get stuck together. And I'll do this quite often in a model, is I'll go through and I'll look to see what bits, what halves I can stick together right at the beginning of the project, just to give the maximum drying time before I come in and sand things, because we don't want any ghost seams or anything like that, thank you very much. So if there's any bits like this is the rudder going together. Again, that had the fabric removed and it was re-scribed and riveted. So all these bits here are going to be glued together right at the beginning of the project, and then just before painting it'll all get sanded down, just to, as I said, to give maximum drying time. Now, for some reason, the rear fuselage and the fin was separate from the main fuselage halves. I don't know if there's other variants with different style of fins or anything. I'm not too au fait with the aeroplane. And in a break from tradition, I decided to glue these together. What I would normally do is glue them to their respective fuselage halves, because I find it's easier to get a seamless joint to match the contours. But doing a dry fit, it looked awesome. So I went ahead and did it as per the instructions. In hindsight, I wish I hadn't, because I can't remember which way round it was. It was a little bit wider, so there was quite a lot of sanding to match up the contours, which was a pain because obviously it was scribed and riveted. So these are the I think they're flaperons rather than ailerons and flaps. Right, this is one of the I've got two. One of the resin engine bulkheads from the Edward Brassin Napier Sabre engine set, and they're going to be mounted on the wings, because this is going to be a tri-motor. So I've just taped together the wing halves, and using the digital calipers, I'm just going to measure the widest part. So that's where it's going to mount on the leading edge, and I'm going to set it back up to the main spar, because obviously that's the strongest part of the wing. So I just need to cut out the leading edge bit, and I'm just going to mark using panel lines as a guide to set the first width, just like that. I'm just going to mark exactly where I'm going to cut. Now I actually made a mistake on the other wing and mistook the inner mark for the outer mark, and I cut the bit out and realised I'd cut the wrong bit out. So I had to glue that back in, which was a right pain. Rescribe and then cut it out again. So having marked out the area, I'm just going to take the razor saw and very, very carefully, I'm just going to start making some cuts. And I'm only going to go as far back as the main spar, panel line. So I'm just using a bit of tape here as a guide. So with the top half done, I could now go in, and you can see I'm not using a traditional forward and back sawing motion. I'm just being very careful to start off with. Now we can go in with the forward and back, but just a few swipes backwards means you're less likely for the saw to slip. So using the scribing tool, now I've got the fore and aft cuts done with the razor saw. I can just deepen that panel line now with the scriber, and then we'll remove that leading edge. Right, we can take the two halves apart, if I can get the tape off. There was an awful lot of masking tape used on this model. You'll see when you get to the painting, when we get to the painting video, how much I actually used. Gallons of it. So by separating the fuselage halves, the wing halves, it's going to be easier now. Because we're on the flat surface, we can just come in with the razor saw, just deepen that line, and then eventually just remove it. So once we've actually gone through, we can use it as a traditional saw and just saw along the edge, and that piece just comes away. It's important just to get into the corners with a scalpel blade just to sharpen them up. And a test fit, and that fits great. And that's it. So in the next one, I use some strip to detail up the fuselage halves. I do an awful lot of scratch building with some 3D printed resin parts from a friend of the channel, Nige, and again, lots more plastic strip and stuff. We do a bit of plumbing. And we do a bit of chipping. So thank you very much for watching, and yeah, join me on the next one where we do the interior. I'll see you then. Bye bye.